Good afternoon. My name is Sarah Carr, and I'm the editor of The Great Divide, a year-old reporting team at the Globe that's dedicated to writing and reporting on race and equity in education. On behalf of the Globe and the Harvard Graduate School of Education, I'm delighted to welcome you to this public conversation as we ask the question, what does all in this together look like at the start of a new and most unusual school year? We're very excited to talk with all of you. If you have a question for the panel, please use the Q&A button, which you can see at the bottom of your screen. We've gotten a lot of questions in advance, but would also like to take some live ones later on the hour. I want to briefly welcome our panelists. We have Kimani James, who is a senior at Boston Latin Academy. We have Kwame Adams, who taught for the last 5 years in Boston Public Schools and is currently the program manager in the Office of School Transformation. We have Patricia Callan, a parent in the Beverly Schools, and we have Almia Beda, who is superintendent of the Chelsea Schools. I would also like to welcome Sarah Dryden Peterson, an associate professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And to kick it off, I'm going to turn it over to her to pose a few introductory questions.
Thanks so much, Sarah, and welcome everyone. As Sarah said, my name is Sarah Dryden Peterson, and I am on the faculty at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, also a former Massachusetts middle school teacher and parent of 2 daughters entering 5th and 8th grade in a private and a public school in Boston. Until now, most of my work has been in war settings globally and with refugee families and communities. But I've become increasingly aware of the connections between the pain that we're experiencing now in the United States and disruption and uncertainty in refugee contexts, as well as the kinds of skills and ways of thinking that can be productive across these contexts. Crisis, as we're experiencing, often throws us into short-term thinking about our own health and the safety, and our own safety, and brings to the surface our fight instincts to protect ourselves and our loved ones. Crisis can also exacerbate inequities in any given society, the race and class lines that impact who has resources to adapt and to make decisions that can control and cushion. A crisis like our current pandemic also gives us the hard opportunity to see the impacts of our individual decisions on others. One of my values is about allocating resources in ways that allow all children to thrive. Boston, like so many other districts, is prioritizing students with the greatest needs in a phased-in return to in-person learning. As mother of a child who will not be eligible for early return, but who benefits so much from interactions with others and relationships with teachers and peers, there's a real tension for me. As we make decisions about and begin to experience education this academic year as teachers, as students, as parents, we experience that our values and our priorities can no longer lie beneath the surface of going about our daily lives. We're faced with questions of, what do I need? What do others need? How do these needs come together? And how do we move forward in young people's learning when these needs are in tension and we have limited resources? These are real dilemmas, practical ones on which we can work even harder to learn more, to weigh more evidence, and to generate more good ideas and more resources. But there are also ethical questions that force us to understand our values, our priorities, and our goals as individuals and communities. What are these tensions? And how do we think through the ways in which we act and the consequences of our actions? As with most big challenges, the ways forward reside not only in what decisions and actions we take, but how we make those decisions and how we take actions with each other. So the questions that we ask of ourselves and each other become ever more critical as we chart the pathways forward together. As Sarah Carr and I came together last spring, we realized that we wanted to have more public conversations on these tough and enduring questions, where we can step away from us versus them situations and think about what being all in this together really means in practice. We're excited for this conversation with all of you. So Sarah, Patricia, Kwame, Almi, Kaimani, I'll turn it back over to you now to begin the discussion.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sarah, for framing this so thoughtfully. I think we're going to dive right into the conversation. We really want to leave some time to hear your questions. And I'm going to begin with throwing one out there for Kimani. This moment, I think, for so many people is really defined by a scarcity of resources when it comes to our time, our money, in some cases, safe school buildings, and in-person instruction opportunities for many. As a student, who do you think the district should be prioritizing when it comes to in-person learning? And do you think that students, including yourself, are on board with the fact that some kids in the city of Boston might go back to classroom instruction much earlier than others, and that some might not have access to it at all this school year?
Yeah, definitely. I want to start by saying thank you for having me here. I do think it's a very important conversation to have. In terms of who, as a student, who I believe should be prioritized first in the district's plan to reopen, I do think that students with greater academic needs, those with IEPs, and just overall students who need more attention than other students may need to really be successful in the classroom need to be prioritized first. If you look at the district's plan, students who are going back the earliest are the students with the greatest academic needs. And that is one part of their plan that I very much do appreciate. And I think the conversation has to be more centered towards, how are we going to make sure that they're getting that in-person critical learning that they need to succeed in the classroom while also maintaining their health and safety for themselves and their loved ones. And I think that that is the tricky part. We are in a pandemic and the conversation around that can be very controversial. I think that, on one side, I think it's very resourceful, and I think it's very smart to have any type of plan that gives students with greater academic needs more focus in the classroom to make sure that they're truly succeeding. On the flip side, though, since we are in a pandemic, I think that it's also very critical to look at the implications of COVID and, the season that we're heading into and sort of the time. The district's plan says that these students would be going back in October. My fear, and the fears that my peers and colleagues have also expressed, is that this may not be the safest time to send our students back because it is going to be the height of flu season. And we've already heard from the CDC that flu symptoms are almost synonymous to that of COVID symptoms. And I think that's really scary, especially if we're talking about sending our little ones back first. They are known not to be the most cleanly in the classroom. So I definitely do think that that's something that a lot of people fear. That's something that a lot of people are talking about. And I really do think it's all about continuing to revisit the negotiation table, continuing to listen to community members, parents, students, teachers, and really just adjusting and modifying those plans so we can really strike the balance between giving those students who need more attention and focus in that academic area while also keeping them safe.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So would you have preferred that the district bring students back right now, pre-flu season, or just kind of defer deciding about it until we see how things are looking as 2021 approaches?
I personally think that we should have waited until things were more clear. I think that across the country, states were decreasing pre 4th of July. Then the 4th of July came and things started going crazy. And I do think that because we are approaching flu season and because top medical advisors in the country have already came out and stated that the fall is going to be tough on the country as a whole. I do think that we should have waited just a bit longer to see what exactly is the best time to send our students back. So yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Kamani. I want to throw that question about scarce resources out to the entire panel, and just ask as a superintendent and as somebody who taught over the summer and last school year, and as a parent, how you think about how to allocate your own scarce resources in this time.
Yeah, I can answer. I can go ahead and go. And thank you so much for that brilliant answer, Kamani. I recommend that you become a superintendent. But again, scarce resources during this time, I think it's important that we think about safety always first for families and for our staff. I think that's like the most important thing right now. And then to me, the second most important thing is mental health. And I'm very concerned about mental health. So when I look at my budget and I'm going, okay, what are the needs? I'm thinking of increasing social work services. I'm thinking of increasing, how can we increase family and community engagement? How can we put our resources to increase those areas where we're engaging families? And because in Chelsea, we're starting with a full remote start, the critical need for me and the question that I have is, how do I engage my families? Because we know that in the spring, we didn't engage all of our families. And so we need to connect better to our families. And we also know that 46% of our families in Massachusetts are Latino families. We're concerned about their mental health of their child. And so I'm thinking as a superintendent, how do I ensure that we're reaching students who are falling through the cracks, that we're reaching out? And so over the summer, we provided cell phones to our social workers so that way they could take phone calls from students at any given time. And we have a hotline on our website, or a number to call that's there, because it's the mental health right now, I think is critical. Safety, again, we invested in our funds in PPE for when we do come back to in-person learning, because we want to make sure that everybody is safe. So there's just a couple of things that I'm thinking about.
How you doing? Thank you for having me here. It's also really nice to be on a panel with a former student of mine, so happy to be here. I think for me, when I'm thinking about scarce resources, I'm recognizing that in certain districts and certain communities, we're used to operating with scarce resources. I think it's just a matter of our access and the way that we go about spreading those resources and tapping into them has changed dramatically. I think one of the things that I really enjoyed seeing in the beginning of COVID was, even though the city was shutting down, the ways in which the city began to fill the gaps that a lot of local legislators or the governor and other people like that were missing. The way that you saw local restaurants donating meals to families, and like organizing caravans of people to deliver food, deliver like the hand sanitizer, the gloves, like all of those PPE things that they may not have had access to as quickly, because we all know that you haven't been able to buy a can of Lysol in months. Lysol wipes are hard to find. When you go into the store, they tell you can take one box and that's it. Or sometimes you go to the store and where they have the senior hours now, it's hard for you to acquire certain things. So I think for me, a big thing was seeing how much the community has stepped up, because I think a lot of times we have these deficit orientations towards the community and say like, oh, they need this, they need that, they can't do this, they can't provide this and that. And I just saw beautiful and brilliant people just stepping up to the plate and making sure that the community was taken care of. Because I think what COVID did was, yes, we knew we had scarce resources, but it actually showed how scant everything was. But I think it also reawoke in a lot of those community values and a lot of people to step up to the plate and fill in those gaps that we're so used to seeing that in our normal environment is easy to walk by and ignore. But when we saw that it got very dire and like literally our community was at stake, how all of us could pull together our resources to fill those gaps, to make sure that families were getting the materials that they needed, but also the ways in which different people, whether they were providing those mental health resources for free or those physical activities for free. A lot of people were just adapting their practices to online models and doing it for free just to make sure that the community had access to wellness, and not just physical wellness, but mental wellness. So I think when we're thinking of scarce resources, I just saw the beauty of my community come out in terms of the many ways in which people stepped up to the plate to fill in those voids that are always there, but not as easily noticed when we're in our normal state pre-COVID.
Hi, thank you so much for having me here. Just to kind of bounce off what Kwame was talking a little bit in terms of who is good at figuring out how to make do with limited resources. The absolute rock stars in my community of this entire experience have been the cafeteria workers. They have adapted as more and more families have required help with food. They have and not only needed their their regular school meals to continue to go on, but then also feeding families over the weekends and having fresh vegetables and not just the bag lunches go home with families. They just adapted. Every 3 weeks they would kind of mix things up and figure out how to do it better. And they're doing just incredible work. And I think it's because they have always cared for the people in the community who have needed to be cared for. It's something that they have a lot of experience in and they take a lot of pride in. And I think that really speaks to some of what Kwame has experienced too in his community. I think that it's just, there are some people who have had an interest in being a force for good for such a long time, and we can look to them now for guidance on how to be forces for good. In terms of answering the question about the structure of the coming back of the Boston schools, I agree with Kamani so much that on both points, that coming back has to follow science. And also that the best thing about that plan, which I wish we did something like this in Beverly, is that we're looking at, instead of looking at the community as a monolith, Beverly is looking at the community as a monolith. And I feel that this decision from the Boston schools looks at the community as a whole bunch of individuals who have different needs at different times. And the first thing that I thought when I realized, schools were going to be going back in was what can I do? And I was like, I gotta get out of the way. I could teach my kids. I've got to get out of the way of schools and the students who need a lot of help. And that was the first factor in me deciding to homeschool this year, was that I just felt like adding another kid who has a parent who teaches, I teach part-time, that's my job. I could just do it and they wouldn't have to worry about Cora. And I could be one less person who they have to find a place for, which I felt like would be the most beneficial thing to do. Now I'm like, it's a really complicated decision because, school loses funding when I leave. I think Cora's an asset to the school. She's a good kid. I think they like having her there, and she loses out by not getting to go and see her friends. But it felt like the best thing that our family could do for Beverly was to just step aside and still stay engaged with the school as much as we can. And when they're looking for donations of Lysol wipes, if I have Lysol wipes, I'm dropping them off and everything. But not that I have any Lysol wipes. I don't like a secret supply. But that has been kind of how we've decided to contribute by just not taking up that space. So anyway, that was kind of.
What grade is Cora in?
She's in second grade. And yes, is very germy. Kamani, you're right about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you just articulated was kind of the ways in which there can at times be um, this this tension between sort of what might be our individual and familial needs and kind of wishes and what's best for kind of the broader community, and they're not always in sync, and it's sometimes constantly changing. So I just want to, I guess, open up to any of the panelists this question of just how do you think about education working toward the common good? And as in this moment, like Patricia just articulated, you face so many individual decisions. Are there times when they come into tension with that common good?
I guess I can start off. Um, I'd say that, so sort of my perspective on education, I'll just start, is that I find education to be extremely valuable. I grew up in a household where my mother always told me that education is the key to success. I took that and I ran with it. And as I became older, I started to realize that there were a lot of students who weren't necessarily getting the education that they were entitled to. They weren't being given the necessary resources they needed in order to actually succeed in their classrooms. And that's essentially why I became an advocate for, you know, bettering the education system overall. And I think in this particular time in COVID, I think it's extremely critical. And, you know, I've said this numerous amount of times in other functions that other organizations I'm a part of have hosted. I think it's extremely critical that we really start to reform and analyze certain aspects of our education system, specifically the quality of work that we're giving our students and how pedagogy is executed in the classroom. I think that is extremely important in COVID right now. It's extremely important for students to know that quantity is not what matters, it's quality. There is a way to give students a reasonable amount of work and still have it convey the entire content or subject area that the teacher is trying to convey in that particular lesson, and then have it be executed in a way where sort of all students, regardless if they are more visual learners or more, you know, just like audible learners, that their needs are also being tended to sort of universally. So I think that's extremely important in the time of COVID, and that teachers are given the resources to be able to do that and given the training and the practice to be able to meet the needs of their students.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's really valuable. I want to turn to Kwame and Almi for a question next. At times, just even this week, the rhetoric around school reopening has turned negative in some communities, and in some cases pitting some teachers who are against an in-person return against some parents who are very in favor of an in-person return. And, you know, it's also a moment when family educator trust is just more important than ever, or as important as ever. And I guess what are your thoughts about how we can change that us versus them framing through our words and actions, and how we can kind of build and maintain that trust?
Sure, I do think you're right. It's at this point in time, reopening really is controversial because you have the safety, and you're thinking about the safety as a superintendent. That's like forefront on my mind. And then you're also thinking about education at this, and it's what gives, and then it pits, as you said, the parents against the teachers. And really, for a superintendent, you're kind of in the middle, and it's a no-win situation in any decision you make. And so being in that predicament is tough, but at the end of the day, at least for us in Chelsea, with our percent positivity rates, it boiled down to safety and what was going to be most safe for everybody in our community to stop the spread of COVID. And so then you say, then it's the, like, I'll give an example. And this was just the other day, I was walking out of my office at City Hall, and a parent had a 4 or 5 year old child in a stroller, and was like, I really need help. Like, he's autistic. The doctors have said that he's lost ground. I don't know what to do. I need to get back to work. And so at that moment in time, I didn't have an answer for her, because we're not in school. We're providing services, but the whole, how do I take care of my child? I'm a single mother, he's autistic. I said, let me get your name and your address, and I will find support for you somehow, some way. And so that is the tension, right? And so for me, building that trust between teachers and families is really important in our community. And so because we can't be there in person, we've initiated what we call trust visits up front. So all this week, as part of our 10 days that we negotiated with the union, our Chelsea Teachers Union, and we've committed to building relationships through what we're calling trust visits. And teachers are either going, meeting with parents outside over with tents, so we're socially distanced. Tell me about your student. What's your hope and your dream for your child? What are your hopes? And tell us about how your child learns, so that way when we're in remote, we can do a better job. And then also trying to really make sure that every family is connected with, so we don't lose our families, that they have a Chromebook, that they have Wi-Fi. Do you have a Chromebook? Do you have Wi-Fi? So really it's about building trust, and therefore we call them trust visits, not conferences, but it's really about building trust, because we want to reach out to our families and say, we're here, we're available during this time. So that's just kind of how I'm looking at it from a superintendent's perspective, and how do we build community.
For me, when it comes to the idea of family trust, I think we have to just admit that all of our schools weren't doing the best job at seeing families as fully competent partners. We have schools where it's pretty much, don't call us, we'll call you. There are some schools where parents are up and down the hallways, and then there are some schools where the parents come up to the front door. You may wave, say hi, have a little chit chat, and then that's like the extent of your communication. And I think what COVID did was it actually exposed a lot of the poor relationships that were existing in not only school buildings, but also particularly in classrooms. In terms of the lack of comfort or the lack of responses that you're getting from people, I don't think it's simply a symptom of COVID, but rather a direct outcome for the lack of relationships that existed before this pandemic. Because I think if you weren't able to build relationships with people when they were already vulnerable, but now when they're extremely vulnerable and don't really want to divulge too much information, or something in their house has changed and they may be picking up additional shifts and leaving their kids at home, and if they tell you that, you may file a 51A and all the controversy that comes along with that. I think this is what you're seeing coming up in terms of a lot of this mistrust between educators or school leaders and like families and community. And I think what needs to happen as a result to mend those relationships is that schools have to just be honest, also allow themselves to be vulnerable with families, and be very direct in the ways in which they communicate. You need to communicate with people in more than robocalls, more than emails, and more than surveys. And I think even home visits may not be ideal right now, but honestly, you can stand on your porch and I'll literally just come out my car door and I'll talk to you from outside the car. We have to get creative in the ways in which we engage families, because what we were used to before is not what we can go back to after this pandemic. I think this pandemic has allowed a lot of things get swept under the rug, and COVID came like this big gust of wind that just came and lifted up the rug and took the rug up the street. And now we have to sit here and look at all the dirt and bones that have been under that carpet. And I think it requires a lot of us to just be very intentional in humanizing our families, humanizing the communities that we're working in, and making sure that we're not looking at people as less than because they don't possess a certain credential. And I think that that's more common in education than we like to believe, but that also is why we don't value family and community perspective as much, as because we feel as though since they lack credentials or lack this expertise or lack this experience, they don't have anything of value to give us. So I think it's very important for us to change the ways in which we engage with them, because I don't believe in the idea of like a new normal, because what we had before and defined as normal wasn't working. And I think that this came to show us that things aren't working so that we can be very intentional in creating practices that are equitable, that are actually inclusive, and providing wraparound services that educate the whole entire student. Certain students shouldn't have access to things just because of their GPA. Certain students shouldn't have access to things just because of the part of Boston that they live in or because of their zip code. We for long always have known that people are defined by their zip code. Like I grew up in Mattapan, and where I am now versus where they thought I was going to be, that's not the same place. And I think we have to have more people in front of our families, in front of our community, just being very strong and stern about reshaping what we understand to be public education, reshaping what we've come to see as quality education. And though we constantly apply those like very white middle class standards onto like communities, but we don't also give them that same sense of agency or empower them to advocate at those same levels or create those entry points for them to communicate. So I think a lot of it, when you're talking about mistrust, you have to develop that trust in order for us to move forward in a very meaningful way. And we can't do that without involving community members and families as full partners. And I also think that sometimes when organizations or organizers want to talk to us, and they may not say the things that we want to hear, but that criticism matters. And their hearts are also in the best place in terms of fighting for the community, because a lot of things get lost in the bureaucracy. So I think we just have to be very intentional about the spaces that we create and also the outcomes that we want for those spaces, and work towards that goal and not allow ourselves to get trapped in a bunch of rhetoric that is meaningless and not actionable.
Mm-hmm. If I may comment on one more thing, one of the things that the trust visits is doing is it's bringing community together. So we solicited volunteers for the community for, would you like to be an interpreter? So we have students, like former students who are interpreting. We have some school committee members and our local partner organizations. And so just really engaging the community in this, because it's important that we reach out to our families during this time. And I am imagining that when we get and we reflect on the visits, we're going to learn more about our families and what they're going through, so that way we can better meet their needs and connect them to community partners. So I'm excited to see what the feedback will be.
If I may just, go off what Mr. Adams was just saying. First of all, I 100% agree. Beautifully put. Back when the pandemic first hit, and I was having conversations with the Boston Student Advisory Council and educational leaders in the district, I told them these issues that we're seeing are not new issues. These issues have always been here. It's just that those at the very top haven't been listening to community members. And I definitely do, I've been advocating for this for a long time, and I'm going to continue to push for it. I do believe that when we talk about creating policy that can not just reform our education system, but truly give students what they've been missing out on, specifically Black and Brown students, we're talking about actually going to those communities and actually hearing what they have to say. I'm on the Boston Student Advisory Council, also known as BSAC. We're a student-led organization, and we are very representative of the students across the district for the most part. However, I do think that a lot of the times, educational leaders and policymakers at the top like to go to organizations like ourselves and essentially call it a day. And I think that it's important to remember that, you can have an organization like BSAC that is representative of the student body of the district, but that doesn't exclude, that's not an excuse to not go a step further and actually go into those pockets of that community and actually speak to people? What about the students who, I'm a very ambitious student. I think that a lot of the students on BSAC are very ambitious and we do a lot. But what about the students who aren't on BSAC? What about the students who aren't in a student-led group? What about the students who just go to school, go to work, and then go home? What do they think? Their opinions matter as well. So I think that I agree with Mr. Adams. We do need to actually listen to the community, not just community organizations, but individuals in the community whose voices may not be represented and translated through those community organizations.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important point, Kamani. And the students who aren't in BSAC are the most likely to probably feel marginalized or alienated from the system and potentially have the most valuable information to share about what's contributed to that. So thank you. I want to move into some questions that have been submitted from everybody listening today. And we've received a number of questions that all speak to sort of how we can better support each other in this time. There was one, how can the broader community strategically support students of all backgrounds as school starts this fall? How can parents support other parents in strategic and structured ways? How can parents best support teachers during the time in tangible ways? So I was hoping that you could all speak to that a bit, and particularly looking at that first one of supporting students of all backgrounds, but also I think the other two are really vital as well. And I know that you, Kamani, and some of your friends developed a support network last spring, and I wondered if you could start by talking a little bit about that.
Yeah, definitely. So when the pandemic first hit and we transitioned to online learning, my friends and I created a iMessage group chat, and we named it COVID University. And essentially, the way it operated was it simply served as a group chat where we discussed political issues, we discussed homework, our mental health issues, like where we were right now in terms of mental health. And overall, I think that the network that we created served as academic and mental health support. We were FaceTiming each other during our virtual lunches, asking each other how our days were. We were FaceTiming each other after the virtual school day ended and, essentially forming a study hall where we all did homework together. And we were able to help each other on different subject areas whenever we needed to. And then later in the day, like if it was a Friday, for example, we would do something called Netflix party and, all sort of reward ourselves for the hard work we did during the week at school. So I think things like that are really critical and imperative to form when it comes to students, especially because resources are so scarce and because of the way things are looking at this moment. I definitely do encourage students out there and even teachers to encourage students to be able to really form that network and that just sort of relationship amongst your friends, because I think it can be really, really beneficial in the long run. I'm confident when I say that I would not have made it mentally between March and June if it wasn't for that group chat and just the emotional and academic support that I was gaining from my friends.
Great. Does anybody else want to speak to the support question, particularly maybe offer up some examples and thoughts of how we can be supporting as a community students of all backgrounds?
Sure. I wouldn't mind touching a little bit on something Kamani said in a previous answer about quantity versus quality versus quantity in terms of academic expectations of students. Something that I have noticed that has happened in my community is that a lot of parents are saying that my kid only has so much time that they're spending at school, that it's so much less than they're spending at school when they're in the building. High school students in particular do a tremendous amount of work. There's a lot of work in being a high school student, and to ask all of the high school students to do that work much more independently or in huge Zoom calls, where your one little square, is an awful lot to ask, and sometimes I think maybe unnecessarily, given that the situation we're in right now is a harm reduction situation, right? We want to get like the best part of the learning and the most vital part of the learning, and maybe let go of some of the things that are just going to become overwhelming for students and parents and teachers to carry on and continue with. And I think that adjusting those expectations is something that the community at large could do. Parents need to know, this is so complicated because the parent versus teacher conflict in Beverly isn't the same as the parent versus teacher conflict in Boston. There's a level of privilege and class distinction where you have parents in Beverly having an incredible amount of control over the decisions being made in the school system. I mean, the school committee just last night changed their decision about something because so many parents complained about it during the school committee meeting. And I do think that that's something that in my situation, parents need to adjust. Parents need to think about what is possible right now. And I think that in other schools need to adjust and think about what is possible for parents. I mean, one of the complaints that I've heard is school's not supposed to be daycare. We can't all go, I've heard from teachers, we can't go back to school because your kid needs a preschool teacher or a daycare teacher. I'm like, but school is daycare, school is childcare. Like, we've set our whole society up to depend upon schools to take care of kids so the parents can go to work. And if we're not going to take care of people, if the government isn't going to take care of people so they can stay home and stay safe, then somebody has to pick up that slack. It's always been schools, and it hasn't worked before, and it's really not working now. And I think that is it's a big conversation that we have to have with people outside of teachers, outside of school districts, outside of administrators. I think we have an opportunity after this is over, if this ever ends, to make a world that is so much better, and look at things from such a higher point and see the bigger picture, and a picture that includes so many more families, and really lifts those families up. I'm desperate for a silver lining. I guess that's the silver lining I'm looking for. Is like, if that rug is really blown up here and we're seeing all the debris underneath that's been there this whole time, maybe we can do something about it moving forward. So I would like to see the community think outside their household and think outside their kids, and imagine what it's like to be a teacher with diabetes trying to go back to teach now. And I would like teachers to remember that parents have always depended on schools to help them survive. And when that's taken away, it's a big deal. It's a big deal. So anyway, I don't know if I have a great answer.
That's really thoughtful. And I loved your framing of kind of thinking outside of our own households. One question that kind of flows from that came in is how much the focus is and should be on teachers and their welfare right now. I wonder if anybody wants to take that one.
Yeah, I can start with that one. I think one of the things, and I'm pretty sure if you all were on social media, even if you remember being on the news, when COVID first hit, that was probably about the highest percentage of teacher appreciation I've ever seen. And I'd been in a classroom for over 5 years at that point. People were like, I don't know how you do it. Like, I'm home with my kids and it's driving me crazy. Like, And there were all these comedians making jokes, all of these memes, like all of these things that were like, teachers, thank you. And then after a few months, that kind of like just fizzled out, and we just became these selfish people who don't want to teach people's kids and just collect the check because we're sitting home struggling to figure out virtual teaching and learning. And I think it comes to a point where we recognize that we saw the value of teachers momentarily, but then their value turned into an inconvenience, like the way in which you not doing your job this way, or the way in which your job has now shifted or changed, has now inconvenienced me. So I'm gonna and project all of my frustration onto you. And I think we oftentimes neglect, like a lot of times mental health came up in this conversation, but like people don't talk to teachers about mental health enough, period. I think even pre-COVID, when we think about the number of students that we engage with on a daily basis, and then the number of families we engage with, but also just the different stories and paths that people are on, and just how you consume all of these things. And you're aware of so many things. Some things you have to keep to yourself. Some things you're like helping the family with in the background, because if anybody else found out about it, it would explode and turn into something else. Like, so it's not like you were ever just a teacher. You were a friend, you are a confidant, you are a school counselor, you are all these things. The hats just stack up, you know? And I think enough focus hasn't been like, okay, pause. Like, let's go back to that point where we appreciated teachers for what they did and all the things that they had to do, and then recognize the ways in which we could meet somewhere in the middle. And I think this returns to our place about those relationships. Like the families that I had strong relationships with, their son or daughter would come one day and they had a bowl of food. They had a plate of something, or somebody went home to Nigeria and now I have a whole new suit, or I have a bag full of fabric. Like there are just different ways in which teacher welfare looks, but it's a lot of it has to do with some of those relationships. And my thing is just as we move forward, like, yes, we may not agree on a lot of things, but there aren't a bunch of people sitting here like, oh yes, bring them all in. And if we all get sick, who cares? Like, I think people are just really, really concerned about their safety. And I think we downplay the amount of people that are in intergenerational households. And the last thing you want to do is bring that to your grandmother or to your mother or your sick aunt, et cetera. And I think people are downplaying a lot of those real fears and like real negative ways that this whole thing could take on people. So.
And if I can comment and dovetail on that, so we were while we were deciding, should we reopen in person or should we do remote learning? I would have these community forums and listen, mostly the teachers. I had one Zoom call with 130 teachers, and I will forever remember this because they were just so anxious. And so even though it was like kind of like I was the target in a way, and that's and that it is what it is. I had to reflect on that moment as an educator and think, okay, I used to teach kindergarten, and kindergartners have a ton, like they're wiping their noses, there's germs everywhere. And then I had to say to myself, would I want to come back and teach kindergarten under this environment? So I had to step back. And then I had to say to myself, why are people like so anxious, and really it's and they're anxious about this, and then it's like you have to lead with empathy in that moment. And what I realized is that there was a fear, and fear is real. And so when I started to put myself back into the teacher mode and get back into teaching kindergarten, it became so real to me. It's like, I understand it now. I understand why there's so much hesitation and fear for our teachers. And so that was a pivotal moment for me, because being fearful or having anxiety or being upset about something doesn't mean that they're necessarily upset with you as with me. It was the superintendent. It was, I'm really scared, or I have a lot of anxiety about this. And so when I could look at it from the lens of compassion and see what was really going on, then I could see it with clearer eyes. And so then I started to think about it a bit more with like compassion. And so I think it's important that we, especially as a leader, I have to step back and say, okay, what is causing so much fear or anxiety for the teachers? And it was easy to do because like I said, teaching in kindergarten, you get germs everywhere. I was the queen of purepearl gel before COVID-19. So you just have to shift gears a little bit.
I'd also,
oh, sorry, go ahead, Connie.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say that whiplash of teachers should be millionaires to teachers are selfish and need to get back to work really was one of the most disappointing things to me that I experienced on social media. I remember that switch. It was very distinct over the summer. And I'm also baffled that parents who have had kindergartners can't find that same empathy that you're talking about, Almi, because they know what kids are like and they know what it's like to be in a school, because the first 2 years your kids are in school, they're sick every month. They get to come home sick because they get used to all the new germs. So that has been interesting too. I'm gonna pass it back over to Kamani while I collect my thoughts.
I just want to say that I definitely agree. I think teachers are very much underappreciated, especially with the tireless work that I saw teachers do just in my school alone, trying to really get a handle on virtual learning when everything went crazy back in March. I do think that it's really just a matter of empathy at the end of the day, like I've heard you all say. I think that, we all have different opinions and perspectives, but at the end of the day, we all need to empathize with one another's emotions and experiences and just really be understanding of that, because it's only then where we can actually move forward and begin to sort of, form a cohesive and largely agreed upon sort of consensus and policy that sort of gives everyone a little bit of what they need and what they want. What I'm about to say may sort of turn the conversation a little bit, but I also think that, when we're talking about parents being very eager to send their students back to school, I honestly think that it's an issue of, at least what I've seen, what I've heard, I think it's an issue of race and class. Because I've seen so many Black parents who are working 2 to 3 jobs just to feed their kids and to keep a roof over their kids' heads, who, the pandemic and them being in their small children specifically being home and them having to watch over them, that's hard. That's taking away from their hours, less money. We all know that gentrification in the city is booming. Rent is getting much more expensive. I think, these are really systematic, deeply rooted issues that just go all the way back to the root cause of, I think, racism and classism. And I just wanted to say that I could have a whole other spiel about that, but I just did want to put that out there because I think it's a very, very important conversation and topic to bring up.
Yeah, and if I can dovetail a little bit on that. So when we did our parent surveys, and it was interesting because our I'm on mute. No, our parents, 50% of our parents in Chelsea were saying, yes, we would love to bring our child back in person. But another 50% said, no way. And so that was shocking to me. And so then as you peeled the onion apart and you started talking to parents, one parent said, there's no way I'm sending my child back to school. And it was emphatic. And I was like, oh, wow, it's interesting. Not the response I was expecting. And then I asked why. And he said, well, I was in ICU for 11 weeks battling COVID-19 and fighting for my life. And I don't care if my child loses a year of instruction. I'm more concerned about the health and safety of my students. So for our families who've experienced COVID-19, and there are many, whether it's a family, a relative, whomever, a close uncle and aunt, they don't want to send their child back to school until they know it's going to be safe. And so it was a different response for us, because the closer you are to someone who's had COVID-19, it's real. And so I was actually surprised with our family survey data when we surveyed our families. And it really was, I was expecting there to be a higher amount of families that wanted to send students to school, but that was not the case.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that, yeah, that really hit brilliantly on how what's considered safe can vary so much from family to family and from community to community. We have just a few minutes left, and I'm going to turn it back to Sarah Dryden Peterson for a couple of wrap-up comments. But thank you all so much.
Great. Well, thanks, Sarah, Patricia, Kwame, Almi, and Kaimani for this conversation. For me, it really feels like an opening and hopefully a continuation of thinking together on this question of how, as individuals, we can pursue our own well-being while also trying to pursue the common good, all in a context of really recognizing this fear and vulnerability and empathy and compassion that all of us have in different ways at different times based on our experiences. One of the areas we've talked about today is really the challenge of limited resources and the kind of hard decisions about how to allocate them. But I think one of the real hopeful elements that has come out of that conversation today is that resources may be scarce, but resources can also be created. So we've heard about how new resources are created from need, how Kaimani is doing with his peers in the COVID University group chat, and Almi described new trust visits that might have been desired before, but now there's the real clear need and impetus to do. And Kwame described community resources that have always been there, but magnified in responding to need, those who know how and where to be there. To support and to be there. One of the other questions that really emerged for me was this thinking about how do we meet the needs of students, which are varied, and really thinking about a new kind of differentiation in how we think about using resources. We often talk about resources as if they're only material resources, but a lot of the resources we've talked about today are about relationships and about time and about trust and about respect and about empathy. And so this kind of deliberate and unrelenting focus on the kinds of resources and supports that are needed, and really focusing on equity as we think about collective decision-making so that all young people can thrive. As Kaimani and Kwame underscored, the issues that we've talked about today in terms of differential allocation of resources are connected to racial inequity and lack of trust and division that are not new. Each of the panelists has also pointed to the fact that perhaps there is an opportunity of us to think about now what being all in this together means in a new way. About issues that are longstanding. So how we build trust that can allow us to support each other in making decisions that support both the individual and the collective, and that could allow us to create, and I think Kwame, you used the word reshape, a kind of better education than was before, built on trust and equity, so that all people can have, Kwame, as you said, the kind of education that they deserve now and for the future that we'll create together. So thanks again to all of the panelists for joining today. And a recording of this session will be available later should you choose to listen. Thanks again to the Boston Globe and the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Good afternoon.